And now I have the pleasure to introduce Peter Hawkins. Peter Hawkins told me, don't spend too much time introducing me because I need to do my work. Okay, so the only thing that I want to say about Peter is that Peter was my supervisor, was an amazing experience working with him. He is a pioneer of supervision on team coaching. You all know who he is. Most of you have read some of his books, and they are even translated to Spanish. So you are probably the team coaching one, if people are familiar with that one that is in Spanish with Granica. And he's the one of the creators of the 7I model, and that was the model that was used by EMCC originally to develop the competency framework for supervisors. So it's important to know that that's the foundation of understanding how supervision works. So Peter, from the UK, great having you here. I am going to give you the highlight so people can see you better. And I am going to, people are going to be, you're going to be being translated. So thanks again for accepting the invitation and being here. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you here.
Gracias, Damien, and bienvenidos and I've also put bem-vindo in case we have any of your Portuguese colleagues from Brazil.
We do have them. Sure that they appreciate that.
And it has been a pleasure to have trained many people, both from South America, from Spain, from Portugal over the years. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And today I'm going to talk about my personal journey with supervision and the many years, because this year is the 40th anniversary since I wrote the model of the seven-eyed model of supervision. So I thought I would say a little bit about what took me to writing that model. It was 1974 when I was first asked to be a supervisor. I was working in mental health, and the person I was asked to supervise was a woman who was twice my age with many years' experience. And I panicked. I thought, what have I got to offer her? She has more experience, more knowledge than I do. So, being eager to get it right, I rushed off to the library to look for books on supervision. There were none. I looked up, and in those days we didn't have the internet, but I looked up where I could find a course on supervision. There were none. So now I decided to get on the telephone and ring people I know who did supervision. And I asked, what is supervision? And they all gave me different answers. One said, oh, I focus on helping the supervisee understand the client better. Another said, oh, I don't do that. I explore what did the supervisor do? Should say, sorry, the supervisor used, and which were effective. Another said, oh, I just asked the supervisee about their countertransference. Another, I explore what's happening between us, the supervisor and the supervisee, as they talk about their client. And another said, I help them look at the wider context in which the work is happening. So now I thought I'm even more confused about how do you do supervision. And a few years later, when I got promoted, I was supervising several therapeutic communities in the UK. And I was sitting down almost every week and supervising the leaders of these therapeutic communities. On Monday, I would sit down with a clinical psychologist who ran an adult community. He'd been trained as a forensic psychologist, and he would always bring his clipboard and would say, "I'm glad we have supervision. I have lots of issues I want to discuss with you." We would never get to the end of his list. The second one, when I turned up, they ran an adolescent community for young people who were disturbed, and they would always share with me the most complex case history of one of the clients. A really interesting story about someone who'd been abused, traumatized, had many symptoms. And we would spend an hour really exploring this. And then the final day of the week, I would go and supervise someone running a group home for really eccentric, disturbed people to keep them out of mental hospital. And I would always take a fresh handkerchief with me. A handkerchief freshly ironed, because within 10 minutes, she would always burst into tears and say, "I cannot go on any longer. It's all too much." And I would find myself helping her with her financial returns and her fire regulations. And as I traveled back at the end of one of these weeks, I thought, how can these all be supervision? In one, I'm having managerial conversations. In another, I'm doing a case history. And in another, I am being like a counselor with my supervisee as victim, all the work being the persecutor and me rescuer. So it was out of that experience that I thought we need a model that integrates what is supervision. And over the years, many people have written, including myself and my colleague Nick Smith. Kadushin was in social work, Bridget Proctor in counseling, and our book was the first book on coaching supervision. And in our book, we adjusted the language to say supervision has a qualitative aspect. We are there to ensure that the coach is working within their competence. We are there to ensure that they are doing no harm. We are there to attend to our ethics and our shadow. And some of you may have attended the Coaching Ethics Forum, which happens every year, where I have spoken on the role of supervision in raising the ethical maturity of the coaching profession. But supervision also has a developmental role. We are there not just to look at the issues with current clients, but to grow the capacity of the supervisee and how they can work more deeply and more impactfully with future clients. And we are also there as part of the profession learning from the emerging work that is constantly coming in at the sharp end of our professional lives. So we are there to develop ourselves, our supervisees, and the profession learning. And we're there also to ensure that the supervisee is resourcing themselves, that their work is being supported, that their growth and development is being adequately resourced. And I won't go into this because we have a limited time, but these slides will be available. But I'll just pick out, a couple of them. You see, I think having been in this profession of coaching since it started in the late 1970s, I would say that I'm in my 50th year of development. And the day that I stop learning from my coachees and the teams I work with and the organizations I work with is the day that I will stop practicing. In fact, some of you online have done courses with me, and I always say, really important, if I don't learn something from every course I teach, and I don't learn something new, teach something new, and upgrade my training, then that will be the last course I ever run. When I first started introducing supervision across many of the helping professions, and particularly in coaching, supervision was seen as something you did while you were in your initial training. But now we realize supervision is not just for Christmas, it's for life. So if I go back and share the screens, if I can have the screen sharing back on. It's now stopping me sharing. Can you?
If you try to share,
You should be able to do
Peter,
it now.
It says it's not. It stopped it sharing.
You can share now.
Great. So that led me on to write the seven-eyed model, which, if you had told me in 1985 that 40 years later it will be being used by many, many professions around the world and in well over 150 countries, I would not have believed you. But what I wrote it for originally, before the first book came out, was I didn't write it for supervisors, but for supervisees. I wrote it for supervisees because I realized there was not a language in which to contract with your supervisor for the supervision you needed. You got the supervision that your supervisor was comfortable doing. We then developed and adapted it in 1989, and that book is now on its 5th edition, and I've just been asked to do a 6th edition, which will come out in 2 years' time. We then, in the 1990s, developed for the first time supervision for coaches and for organizational consultants. And with Nick Smith, I wrote the book in 2006 and 2013. And then we started to apply it to systemic team coaching, which I wrote about in 2011 with a 10-eyed model. And as I'll try and say today, it is still evolving. That model has never ceased growing. And one of the really interesting things for me is I keep still learning from it. So let's look at our definition of coaching supervision. And you don't need to translate this because I've got a translation on the right. But it's a structured, formal process for coaches or any practitioner to work with the help of a supervisor. And notice this, supervision is not done by the supervisor. It's a collaborative exercise. It is done jointly, not just by the supervisor and the supervisee. It's done by the agenda that the supervisee's work and life are presenting them with. We are there not to be on the supervisee's agenda or the supervisor's agenda, but life's agenda and the work's agenda. And the purpose is to intend to improve the quality of their practice, grow their capacity, and to support themselves and their practice. And it should be a source of organization and professional learning. Over the years, the model has changed, and a big thank you to Damien, who has written a whole version in Spanish in his book on supervision. It's been translated to many languages and across many professions. And I put not just these editions, and this last one includes the latest research, the one in 2020, not only from coaching, but from psychology, from other social work and other professions in psychotherapy. These two were particularly written for coaches and coaching supervision. And then more recently, we've applied it to a much more systemic and ecological perspective. So let me just briefly go back through it. Because many people see the model as bringing together 7 different bunches of tools and methods. But at heart, it is a systemic model. It starts by saying that as soon as you supervise, there are 3 systems in play. The first system is the system of the coaching, co-created by the coach, the coachee, and the work and life of the coachee. The second system is the supervisory system. Supervisor, supervisee, and what happens in this relationship. But each of these 2 systems are not only overlocking, but they are part of a much larger context. The world context of the coachee or the clients, their organization, their team dynamic, their culture. What's happening for the coach? Are they in training or are they about to retire? What's going on for the supervisor on their journey? All of those contexts are also in the supervisory room. And it is that interlocking 3 systems that gives us each of the 7 modes. So just for a moment, think about someone you supervise. And think about a situation that has been a challenge for you in the last 3 or 4 months that has been brought to you as a supervisor. And if you can't do that, think about a coaching situation that you have been involved with. So for the first mode, we think about what do we know and what was actually happening in the coaching room. How did the coachee arrive? How did they sit? What was the expression on their face? What was their opening line? And we attend to the fact that often the coaching happens before we even get in the coaching room. We may have received an email from them. We may meet them in the corridor. or we may have to go through an outer office with their personal assistant. They may turn up late. But how does the world of the coachee come into the coaching room? And what do we know about all what's going on in their world and their life? As I say in a lot of my talks on systemic coaching, you are never just coaching an individual. Why? Because when a senior leader walks into the room, their team dynamic arrives inside them. Their organizational culture arrives inside them. All the conflicts in their stakeholder world between investors, regulators, customers, suppliers, employees arrives inside them. And the wider ecology also arrives inside them. So now we then go on to the next mode, which is to stop looking out there at the coachee, but to look at what did the coach do? Not only what did they do, but what was the frames in which they were perceiving the coachee? What were the questions and dilemmas going on inside the coach's head? What options were they thinking about? What did they choose to do and what did they choose not to do? What did they notice and what did they not notice? What were the assumptions they were making? Because, of course, we don't meet the coachee, we meet the coachee as perceived by the coach. And then the third one is to look at what was the dance that was going on in the relational space between the coach and coachee. What was being co-created between them? To do this, we have to help the coach leave the dance floor and get onto the balcony and to see the co-created dance. Some of you know that one of my favorite interventions here is to say, if you and this particular client were cast away on a desert island with no one else, what would happen? Very powerful. People, when I've done it, and Damien was there on the first American Supervision conference, I think, Damien, and I did that exercise live, and I had 80 people thinking about clients and coachees. And we had somebody who'd murdered their client, somebody who'd been murdered by their client, a couple of people who'd had sex, one person who was running away and hiding up a tree, and one was sitting and watching as the coachee built the hut and prepared all the food. And then, of course, I said, whatever you imagined is already happening in the dynamic. The relationship has a life of its own, right? It's a third entity within the coaching space, and we need to attend to it. But you see, like organizational culture, when we're in the dance, we can't see the dance. And that's where supervision can really help. The fourth is to look at what is being re-stimulated within the coach. What issues is it bringing up for them? What's blocking in them? What is their shadow that is getting in the way of their work with the coachee? What are their patterns and their assumptions that are limiting the range of how they can help? And this is where a lot of reframing, unlearning takes place to open up the possibilities for the coach. And then the fifth is to look at what's going on in the relationship here in the room. Many of you will be familiar with the notion of parallel process. And this is based on the fact that some of the most difficult issues that the coach has experienced in their coaching, they cannot articulate or tell you about because they are embodied experiences. They are the unthought known. What they know in their being, but haven't yet made sense of or articulated. These are often the most powerful and important issues to address. And how they show up is what we cannot articulate, we enact. We do to the supervisor what the coachee has done to us. Yeah. One of the most dramatic examples that I use in the book is when a particular supervisee would tell me about a specific client, I could not keep my eyes open. I thought, oh, I need to get to bed earlier. I need to change the time of my supervision so it's after I've eaten and my blood sugar levels are up. Right? I did everything to avoid looking at what was going on in the dynamic. But then my supervisor said to me, why are you skirting around this issue? Why don't you share what's happening with your supervisee? So on my next session, when she shared this client again, my eyes started to get heavy. I started to get sleepy. And I said, can we just experiment? Can you talk about another client and we'll come back to this one? As soon as she talked about another client, I was wide awake. And she said, well, why have you done that? And I said, because every time you talk about that particular client, I can't keep my eyes open. And she said, it's funny you should say that. That's what happens to me when I'm coaching that client. Now, notice there are two levels of parallel process. The first is the embodied resonance that I had not been told about, but I had picked up bodily. But the second, even more important, was the coach was too embarrassed and felt guilty about falling asleep and felt too embarrassed to tell me. And I felt too embarrassed to mention that it was happening to me. Does that make sense? And so it wasn't until I had supervision on my supervision that things shifted. The next level is mode 6, which is often, when people come on our trainings, the one they least utilize, but go away saying is the most powerful. If you think about the example I have just given, it was only by attending to what was happening to me live in the room that the deeper issues emerged. To pay attention to images that come up for me, thoughts that suddenly emerge, bodily sensations, and to use those not as interpretations, but as data. To be able to say, I don't know whether this is at all relevant, but what's just come into my mind is and to put it on the table and to see if the coach picks it up. Often I have had the experience of putting it on the table and the coach says, that doesn't make any sense to me. And then they have come back to a future session and said, you know, when you mentioned, so don't be attached to it, but don't also withdraw it. Just leave it there to see what emerges. And then 7 that we'll come back to is the wider context for the coachee, their organization, the coach, the supervisor. This is a more simpler way of drawing it. And let's look at, in those 40 years, some of the things that we have seen. As Magda mentioned, I had many interesting experiences because supervision got underway in coaching pre-EMCC and pre-ICF, and I should pay my respects to the Association of Professional Executive Coaching and Supervision, who were the first really body to adopt supervision. Pre to EMCC, I then talked at many of the coaching bodies and had a number of my most interesting run-ins in America. And USA was one of the last to adopt it for a number of reasons. One of which is because of fear of becoming like psychotherapy or psychology, and that leading to state legislation and increases in insurance and legal battles. Some of it may be to do with a strong cultural need for independence. As many coaches said to me, I've got my qualification and nobody tells me how to coach. Right? That was in a live meeting that Damien may well have been at many years ago in the ICF. But gradually what we have seen is an extraordinary spread right around the world. We did research in 2005. We did it again with my colleague Eve Turner in 2015, 2016. And the spread of supervision was enormous. But today I just want to say a little bit about where I have taken the work more recently. In my latest book that came out in December with this rather grand title of Beauty and Leadership in Coaching and its role in transforming human consciousness, I talk about how we are now in a world of many interconnected global challenges. Some people talk about this as the polycrisis. But behind the polycrisis is the fact that we cannot deal with any one of those challenges without dealing with the others. We cannot address the climate emergency without addressing world inequality. We cannot address migration without addressing inequality and the climate crisis, because we will see that the climate crisis is actually driving much greater levels of migration movement across the world. They are all interconnected. But I want to suggest to you, and I'll try and share the slides again. It's because Damien hasn't put his dollar in the electricity meter.
No, you know what happened? Somebody is working in the whiteboard and is making notes over your presentation. So I don't know who is doing that. That's the reason why I had to turn it off and on.
All right.
So now I make you co-host, so you can do that now.
Just ignore the scribbles, Damien. But I want to suggest to you that behind the polycrisis is the metacrisis. That at root, these are all symptoms of our collective failure to evolve human consciousness at the speed that the world around us is changing. And there are, at the same time, we have shrunk human consciousness from where the indigenous peoples of South America and North America were and still are in certain places, where their consciousness was ecosystemic and participatory. And we shrunk it to human-centric consciousness, and then from human-centric consciousness to individual-centric consciousness, and then from embodied consciousness to I think, therefore I am, and we retreated to our heads. And then we went further. We retreated to our left hemisphere neocortex. This is the bit that's a very good servant, but an appalling master. And now what we're seeing is AI can take over lots of what the left hemisphere neocortex does for us. Right? The storage of knowledge, the solving of problems, which does give us the opportunity to grow and reawaken a much larger embodied, collective, and ecological and systemic consciousness. And I love these two quotes. One from the great poet and mystic, Sufi, Jalaluddin Rumi, who said, "Why, in the plenitude of God's universe, have you chosen to fall asleep in such a small, dark prison?" And Albert Einstein, the 20th century scientist, who said, "Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." So what does that mean for supervision? I'm going to split this. You see, I think supervision, coaching are part of a much, much bigger profession, which includes leadership development, consultancy, psychotherapy, psychology, spiritual teaching, education. That together we all have one great work. And that is, how do we help all the people we work with to evolve the individual and collective consciousness so that human beings are future fit to live on this planet? That's the great work of our time. What is it we can uniquely do that the world of tomorrow needs? So, what is it supervision can uniquely do? In the book on beauty, I talk about the new leadership paradigm, the new coaching paradigm, the new supervision paradigm. I've already mentioned you are never supervising an individual. The client dynamics, their organization, their team dynamics come into the room. Many of you know I run global trainings on systemic team coaching. And our first level of training, called Team Development Essentials, that we do with coaching.com, I argue every individual coach needs to do. Why? Because one of the most common issues that's brought to coaching by executives is, how do I manage my team? How do I deal with conflict in my team? How do I deal with difficult team members? How do I get my team to step up? So sooner or later, as a coach, you are supervising the team coaching of a team leader. Does that make sense? In the same way that Damien knows, I argue that every coach needs to have a basic training in supervision in order to be an effective supervisee. Secondly, one of the big traps in supervision is that we treat the supervisee as a client. And we start off and say, what do you want to talk about in supervision? It's not the right place to start. I will see the supervisee as my supervision partner. I will ask and start my relationship with them, finding out who does their work serve? Who do they create value for? And who else? Who beyond their coaches do they create value for? The teams, the organizations, the communities, the ecology. And I say, if we got all those people in the room, what would they be saying is the work you and I need to be doing together? It has to be the work, if I'm supervising Damien, I want to be doing the work with Damien that he can't do without me and I can't do without him. And not the work that he wants to do, but the work that his world needs him to do. Yeah. To be on life's agenda, not the supervisees, the organizations, the supervisors, not to take side, but together to walk to what I call it the bottom, the learning edge. Good supervision happens where we spend time where Damien hasn't got the answer, I don't have the answer, but we both know that life is requiring an answer. And together we have to discover it. You see, as I said earlier, all of those things enter the room besides the supervisee, their clients. And I would just ask you for a moment to think in the supervision you give, what percentage of the time are you spending at that learning edge? What percentage of the time are you knowing that what the work we're doing is really critical, but neither of us has the answer? And you're working in that co-creative discovery place. And then to ask, what would you have to do to double that percentage that's at the learning edge, where you are co-creating value not just for the supervisor, the supervisee, their clients, but for all the systems that your supervisee is engaged with and is there to create value for. And so in our latest work, we've talked about the outer rings of mode 7, all of which we need to recognize are in the supervisory room and need to be attended to. I'll leave that because I'd like to just end, and hopefully we might have time for one or two quick questions. So please put any questions in the box. But I want you to do a simple, quick exercise with me. You up for that? Yeah, hopefully. Please think about an issue that someone brought to you for supervision, a very specific problem issue. And I'm going to share with you my 5 steps from grumble to gratitude. So often in coaching and in supervision, people come and talk about their awful boss, their terrible employee, their difficult coaching client. The first step, think about that problem, is to reframe it, changing the word problem to the word challenge. So the CEO came to me earlier this week and said, oh, my non-executive directors are useless. They don't add any value. And I played it back and I said, I hear you have a challenge, Mr. CEO, that you have not yet found a way of partnering with your non-executive directors to co-create value. Very simple reframe. Always locate the challenge not in the client, not in the coach, not in the client's boss, but always in a connection we have not yet found. Very simple. You can do this. Once you do it as a habit, you'll just do it all the time. Thirdly, this becomes more difficult. Whatever problem happens to you in your life, in your supervisory work, in your coaching work, see the most difficult clients as a generous lesson that has been sent to you from life. Our most difficult clients are our best teachers. The fourth step is even harder. Find gratitude in your heart for the lesson that life has sent you. And step 5, now do only what is necessary. No extra, just what is necessary. When I first developed this, very soon afterwards, my 13-and-a-half-year-old granddaughter, she's now 16, while she was staying with us, had a spinal stroke, which took 4 days to diagnose, and she ended up paralyzed from the waist down. A great trauma for her, her sister, her parents, her grandparents. I used this structure every day for 2 weeks. And boy, was it a challenge. Until I could go and visit her and say to her, looking her in the eye, with all my heart, I know, Nancy, whatever happens to you, you will be an extraordinary woman. And she could hear me in hospital. 3 years later, that granddaughter at 16 has just passed her driving test. She's en route to go to the Olympics in Los Angeles in both wheelchair racing and swimming, and is about to get very high grades in all her public exams. She already is an extraordinary woman. I'm not saying what I said made a difference, but it was the best gift I could give her. And if we can work that path, our ability to help our supervisees shift their consciousness. But to do that, we have to have as much empathy and compassion, not just for the coachee in our room or the supervisee in our room, but for everybody and every system that's in their story. We have to be on no one's side, but the side of what is struggling to get born. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you're doing. And do we have time just for 2 quick questions, Damien?
Yeah, we don't have time, but we will make it. So if anybody has a question, now is the time, if you want to put it in the chat box. There is a question here from Clara. Clara is asking, what is the one challenge you would leave us with so we can collaborate to further embody and spread the beauty of supervision?
Well, I wrote this in a book that Eve Turner edited. I think, Damien, you're also in this book, The Heart of Supervision, Coaching Supervision. I wrote about wide-angled empathy. And that's my term, wide-angled empathy and compassion, is about how you have the compassion when the coachee comes for everybody they talk about. and you don't end up on the side of the coachee or the side of the supervisee, but the side of what needs to get born. And you can practice that, right? I train people to practice it watching the news on television. And set your stopwatch and see how many seconds or minutes you can go with empathy and compassion for everybody who appears. Not just every individual, but every country, every organization, every aspect of the world that appears. Yeah, it's a very tough practice. But gradually over years, I've trained myself to now be able to watch the news wide-eyed, open, heart open, and not get reactive. Because that's what the world's asking us to do. And to be able to be in supervision, it makes a difference to be in supervision and not get drawn into being re-stimulated or reactive or trying to make it better, but to actually be just with what is and what needs to happen. That's my challenge to you all, because that's a big challenge for all of us right now. Any last question, Damien?
Yes, there are several here. Chris is asking, what is the difference between challenge and, well, there is two words that are similar to me, Clara. I don't know what the difference between desafío y reto is challenge for me in English.
I had the same trouble. Challenge and challenge. In Spanish, we have two different words, but I think they mean the same thing. So I'm lost here.
Well, I think that maybe the question is, what is your challenge in applying these 5 points of the gratitude strategy that you share with us for us?
Yes. So
what can be a challenge to implement that?
Many people turn up in supervision and they see supervision as a place where they have to bring problems. Yeah. Difficult problems. So occasionally I have supervisees who come and say, oh, I don't know what to talk about because I don't have any problems this month. You see, this is an assumption. And I say, good, now we can do some interesting work. When you don't have problems. When they do bring problems, right? The word is changing it from a difficulty to a learning opportunity. So when a senior executive says to me, oh, but Peter, we can't do that in our organization, I just use one word. When they say, oh, or when Damien says to me, oh, I can't do that as an ICF coach, I just use one word, which is yet. You can't yet do it. We haven't yet found a way of doing that as an ICF coach. And it changes it from a burden to an opportunity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was a great presentation, Peter. That we really all appreciate. People are writing really nice comments in the chat. If people want to also write any comments for Peter, they are in Spanish, some of them, but they say fantastic, amazing, very wise, a lot of positive comments for you, outstanding. It's luxury to have you here and bringing emotions to people. You here see some hearts, some hands. It has been great to have you, Peter. Thank you for making the time to support us in this space. And we hope that you can come back in the next conference to continue the conversations. And let's recognize Peter for his amazing job over the years. Great to have you with us. Thank you for your support. And we will move on to Eva, who's going to introduce our next speaker.
Let me just say, as a way of saying goodbye, the thank you is much appreciated, but the bigger thank you is the bigger impact hopefully this will help you have in shifting human consciousness.